Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anthony House, and I'm from your friendly public policy and government relations team. We sit right over there on the 9th floor. I think we all have heard of the dark net, whether that's technologies like Tor that are used by activists or for less savory purposes, whether that's the Silk Road or other online marketplaces where you can buy or sell illegal goods or services, whether that's the fappening, which is what I'm told that the large-scale publication of naked celebrity photos is now being called. I think it's important for us to remember that this can affect Google and our users. Just today out of Russia, there was news that several million email accounts and passwords were published online, and our security team is hard at work understanding how that affects the people who use our services. And it's therefore a pleasure for me to introduce Jamie Bartlett from Demos, who's just written a book on the dark net, which was published last month. He's going to give us some of his thoughts, and he's promised to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. Please use the microphone there so that the video gets your audio feed. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jamie.
Thanks. Well, thanks so much for having me, everybody. So this was the plan. I'm going to tell you roughly why I wrote the book and roughly how I did the book. I went about doing the research. And then I'm just going to talk about four themes that came out for me that aren't really stated in the book itself, but things that I learned as I went on this journey. And I will leave enough time for questions. I reckon I'll only be speaking for about 25 minutes or so it should be plenty. So, the book itself. Over the last 5 years, but especially over the last couple of years, it will be no surprise to any of you that we keep getting little glimpses of people doing bad stuff online. More than a glimpse, actually. Increasingly, it seems like an avalanche. Whether that's child abuse images, people buying drugs from the Silk Road. Everyone seems to be a troll nowadays. By the way, is this being filmed? Is this going to be made public? I'll say it anyway. We were trolled by Mary Beard recently at Demos because we'd incorrectly used a poor Latin translation of our Demos pamphlet, Vox Digitas. It should have been Vox Digitalis, or some kind of derivation on that. And so she started sending us angry Twitter messages about it. So everyone's suddenly a troll. 2% of British adults say that they have actually insulted a complete stranger online, which means at least one of you in here has probably done that, and would make 2 million people in the UK as a whole. So we keep getting these little flashes of communities and cultures somewhere underneath the surface of what we think to be the internet we all know and love. But the thing that always frustrated me about this was that you never got more than just a glimpse. And you never really learnt about the people that were in these communities and cultures. You just see a little tabloid scare story about it. And you'd never really understand where it came from and why people were doing it and what was really happening. So I set myself the following challenge, that I would spend a year in some of the internet's sort of darkest, most shocking, seemingly shocking subcultures, and I would try to meet the people that inhabited them. And the result was the darknet. Now, for me, the darknet, when I came up with this title over a year ago, the darknet wasn't the thing that everybody was talking about, meaning Tor hidden services and this encrypted part of the net that you can only access using Tor. For me, I called it the darknet because I thought it was this obscure set of cultures and communities that hadn't really been explored and where the darker shades of human nature were on display. That, for me, was the darknet. Now, part of the book is indeed about what we now call the darknet, these Tor hidden services, and I'll talk about those in a second. But just as much of it was password-protected Facebook groups, Twitter accounts, pro-anorexia sites and forums, any part of the internet, really, where people use their perceived or real anonymity or pseudonymity to stretch, I suppose, the limits of human freedom and expression to some of those darker places. And so over the course of a year, I became a moderator of a trolling group. I can't tell you where it was. And I met a handful of pretty extreme trolls. I spent loads of time with neo-Nazis in pubs up and down the country who use Twitter and Facebook in particular to spread their propaganda and their message. I was off to a squat in Barcelona with Amir Tarki, if any of you know him, creator of the Dark Wallet, an application for Bitcoin that makes it a little bit more anonymous, a little bit harder to trace and track, a little bit more of a frustrating thing for governments to have to deal with. Favourite bit, I went to a live cam show of 3 women performing sexually explicit acts together on the screen for thousands of paying customers. And I actually ended up getting pulled into the show myself. Don't try and find that, but you might if you look hard enough. And I bought drugs off the Silk Road, naturally enough. Went into pro-anorexia and pro-suicide forums and sites, and in each case, tried to look at it as objectively as I possibly could, to stand back and not judge. This is not a polemical book at all. It's a series of portraits to hopefully get people thinking and to get people a little bit more au fait with what's going on in these places. And overall, what I find, in fact, what you always find when you look at something more closely, it's never quite as black and white as you imagine. I went in there expecting to be shocked and appalled, and I came out very confused. Moral ambiguity is probably the single line that I use most in this book. So that's what the book was. That's how I went about doing it, and I'll leave sort of time for questions if you want any of the more specific details. And I want to talk about 4 things. Innovation and how creative and innovative these places are. This moral ambiguity point. The empathy that I felt meeting people that I thought I would detest, and then meeting them in real life and finding, actually, I didn't detest them quite as much as I expected. And normalization and how certain behaviors come to be and feel to be extraordinarily normal and ordinary if you surround yourself with them for long enough. So they're the 4 themes. Let me have a swig of water before I get going. Okay, so let's start with the creativity of these sites. Has anyone ever been on the Silk Road? No one ever puts their hands up to that question, but I know some of you probably have. So there's a hand. So the Silk Road, as I'm sure you're aware, well, it's actually now Silk Road 2.0, since the original got shut down in November or late October last year, is an online marketplace where anything and everything, with a couple of tiny exceptions like personal identification and child pornography and now weapons, is available to buy and sell. This is only accessible with a Tor browser. It's a Tor hidden service, and that essentially means the servers are very hard to locate, and anyone using it uses various types of encryption, which makes them very hard to locate. And essentially, you can buy and sell drugs remarkably easy on that site. Now, everybody thinks about the Silk Road as being driven by encryption systems. You have to use Bitcoin, the cryptocurrency, to buy your products. You need Tor to be able to access it. Actually, you can do it without Tor, but it's a very bad idea because you can be traced if you do that. You communicate using pretty good encryption, PGP encryption, and people think that's the secret. That's the trick of the Silk Road, but that's not the secret of the Silk Road at all. And in my chapter, I bought a very, very small amount of marijuana, just a gram or something like that. The reason people use the Silk Road is because it has introduced a genuine market in an industry which has been traditionally dominated by cartels and monopolies. So if you go and buy drugs on the street, your choice is limited to whatever dealer you know and whatever products they happen to have. You have no real comeback mechanism on that. You have no real choice if you don't like what you're getting. And as a result, you, the consumer, suffers. You go to the Silk Road, you have a choice of between around 1,000 vendors, all of whom are competing for your custom, all of whom you can communicate with and talk to, all of whom are rated out of 5 for the quality of the products that they've given you and how good their customer service was, how attentive they were, how good the postage and delivery was. And you know, guess what happens? What a surprise. They are unbelievably attentive, helpful, and completely focused on making sure you, the consumer, are content, because if you're not, you're going to give them a bad review. And everything in this anonymous world depends on reputation. And so they work bloody hard to make sure they have a good reputation. So I emailed one, Drugs Heaven. Dear sir, I'm new to this site. I only want to buy a small amount of marijuana. Could you please advise? Drugs Heaven had an unbelievably wide array of products, replied within 3 or 4 hours, Dear sir, thank you so much for your inquiry. I completely agree. As a new vendor, I too would probably start with a small amount. Perhaps you'd like to try X, Y, and Z product. This is really highly recommended by my other users. I do hope we can do business together. It would be a pleasure. Any more questions, please let me know. Best wishes, Drugs Heaven. Product arrived. 3 or 4 days later, my friends tell me it was very good. So I gave a review. And that's how it works. And you know what, though? And this will lead me on to my second point about moral ambiguity. Think about it for a second. If you are ingesting drugs, you need to know the purity of the drugs that you're getting. You need to have a system to know that it's not being laced with anthrax. 14 people died of heroin being laced with anthrax a couple of years ago in Glasgow. That doesn't really happen on the Silk Road because the vendors are so worried about their reputation. You need to know how pure your drug is because you need to be able to predict how your body's going to react to that. And on the Silk Road, there is a remarkable array of consumer-led feedback on every single product. How strong is it? How should you mix it? What should you do with it? What's the best way of responding if things go wrong? This is a remarkably innovative system, but incredibly familiar to anybody that's been on Amazon or eBay, but one that you would not expect to find in this place. And they have an incredible array of ways in which people can mask their identity. The great difficulty on somewhere like the Silk Road is, of course, everything you're doing is completely illegal. So you can't phone up the police, and some people have done this, phone up the police and complain about the fact that their drugs weren't quite good enough. You're going to get in trouble for that. And the problem is, of course, drug dealers on the whole tend to be not very reliable, and they can run off with your money. They can run off with your Bitcoin. Or the police can raid the Silk Road, shut it down, and all of your Bitcoins vanish. So what have they done? They've created something called multi-signature escrow. It's a bit laborious, but it's a sort of a bit like a payment system where you need all 3 keys to turn to open the lock. So the vendor needs to put his digital signature in. The seller does when he or she receives the goods. The site needs to when they think that the transaction's been completed, and at that point, the money's transferred over from the buyer to the seller, and everybody's happy. And if something goes wrong, the money goes back to the buyer. And this was an innovation that the community developed within about 3 months of the original Silk Road going down, because people thought that the payment mechanism was too centralized and it was not to be trusted. We need to decentralize how payments work so that everyone involved in the transaction has to sign it off. The Silk Road is remarkably innovative, and it has to be. It has to be. Creativity, innovation, the mother of all necessity, right on the edge, and they have to work out ways of operating in a uniquely hostile environment. That's point 1, innovation. The second, and I felt it in the Silk Road, this moral ambiguity, going into these places and thinking I knew what was wrong here and I knew what I'd think about it, and then coming out being not quite so sure. Now, the hardest chapter I had to write was about suicide forums and pro-anorexia forums. So these are the places that sort of encourage people to view those mental health conditions, and anorexia is actually one of the most dangerous mental health conditions that there is, as something of a lifestyle choice, a culture, something to be embraced, something to be encouraged. This was the most difficult, of all the chapters, it was the hardest one to write. It was really distressing to go into these forums. We're often talking about very young teenage girls who are extremely depressed, that are starving themselves of food and suffering greatly as a result. And it's a very similar picture on the suicide forums. And actually just today, I don't know if any of you saw this, but just today, William Melchett Dinkle was convicted in the Supreme Court for having encouraged somebody and assisted them in committing suicide through, it's a Usenet group called ASH, Alt Suicide Holiday, where people go and openly talk about methods for committing suicide. And what this guy did under a pseudonym was to pretend that he too was extremely suicidal and would encourage other people that were in the forum with him to create a suicide pact. People that commit suicide often feel they need someone to commit suicide with. He would create a pact with someone and say sort of, you go first and I'll watch on the webcam and then I'll do it. And of course he never did it. He was pretending to be a 30-year-old nurse when in fact he was a 50-year-old middle-aged married man. And he was convicted again. It was overturned, it was overturned at the Supreme Court yesterday. So it's extremely depressing and difficult. But here's the thing about those suicide forums. I met a number of people who credit those suicide forums for saving their lives, because it was the only place they felt they could go and speak with people who understood them, that were going through the same thing as they were going through, and wouldn't be judgmental. It was something of a release. The opportunity to be able to just share, almost sort of expel some of your fantasies about committing suicide. Suicidal ideation is where people often have these fantasies about committing suicide, and just being able to talk about that with people that wouldn't judge you or demand that you go and see a shrink or demand that you go and tell your family immediately how you're feeling was incredibly relieving. And I met people that have been using these forums for years and years and years. Now, all of us, most of us rather, whenever we're feeling unwell, we go online. I mean, I've done it. I recently had ACL surgery on my knee, so I'm sort of limping around. And your GP's not open all day. And you're sort of late at night, terrified, this feels really weird, what's going on? And you go for every bit of information. You go online and you try and find other people and get advice from them, see what they've gone through. If anyone's done that, and I'm sure a lot of you have, it's actually terrifying. There's been quite a lot of research on Dr. Google and the way that certain types of, if you put in chest pain, I think something like heart attacks comes up higher in the ranking than indigestion or whatever it is. But that's where people go now. And people who are lonely and who are depressed, to be able to find other people like them, for some of them it's incredibly, incredibly helpful. And for others, they might meet a William Melchett Dinkle who will try and push them over the edge and encourage them to commit suicide. And I came out of that thinking, well, I'm not really sure anymore. I sort of assumed that I just want these things shut down. Now I think, I don't think I do want these suicide forums shut down. I think I'd rather they were moderated. I think I'd rather there were people, professionals in them, where people could go anonymously and talk about it, and a professional, someone from the Samaritans, whatever, would be in there moderating the conversation and discussion to make sure it didn't get out of hand, but to allow people to have the opportunity to speak. Third thing, empathy. So, very first person I met writing this book was a really virulent, angry, radical neo-Nazi, who I call Paul. He spends 95% of his time, he tells me, online. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, blogging about white pride and about how we need to restore Britain to its original entirely white population, get rid of all the immigrants, get rid of all the newcomers. He's angry and he's frustrated and he's extraordinarily nasty and mean online. So I went to meet him. After a lot of negotiating, I'd met him online, And I went up to the small town, he lives up north, to meet him. I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea what he looks like. He never shares any pictures of himself. And this guy comes up to me, handsome guy, tattoos, spiky hair, and he was like, "You're Jamie Bartlett off the television. I can't believe you've actually come. I'm so pleased to meet you." And it was him. It was Paul. He was, it's quite hard to say, but I really liked him. I really liked him. I felt so sorry for him. Every time we talked about anything that wasn't to do with immigration and race, we got on very, very well indeed. We had a great laugh talking about football teams and this and that. Really got on well with him. And then the minute I saw him again offline, I saw him again online, it broke down. And he started being angry and vicious and frustrated and annoyed about everything. And obviously, it's extremely difficult to work out precisely what's going on in his head and why he's doing that. But I think what's happened to him in particular, and it's happening to a lot of people, he started off with no real interest in far-right politics, but nothing was going on in his life at all. And I really felt sorry for him as we walked around his town, and he said how he'd love to get involved in politics, he'd love to move to a bigger city. He left school at 16, he's got no qualifications whatsoever. We both knew it was never going to happen. But he has created an identity online that is far more exciting, far more meaningful than anything he does offline. He has thousands of people that listen to his stuff. He's almost boxed himself in because his identity online is the source of so much sort of self-gratification and meaning in his life that he's stuck doing that. He can't break out of it because he has to carry on with that type of behaviour and that language to keep his fans happy, to keep the people that listen to him happy. And so he's sort of a bit trapped in an online identity entirely of his own making. And he got there gradually. He started off being mildly racist, let's put it like that. Then he would have interactions with Muslims in particular on Facebook walls, where if anyone's been on a hostile Facebook wall where things are going to and fro, it really gets quite nasty quite quickly, doesn't it? And it sort of degenerates, a bit like a comment is free comment section. You know, the sort of the law of Nazi analogies, that the longer a conversation goes on, the probability that one person refers to the other as a Nazi approaches 1. Which, ironically, in this case, is actually true in the case of Paul. But each side sort of created demons and enemies of each other. This one-sided, one-dimensional version of themselves that would constantly clash and just harden each other's views in this strange sort of echo chamber, to the point where Paul has become an extremely committed neo-Nazi. But here's the strangest thing about it. He told me one story, and it really sticks with me. He lives on his own, doesn't really have much going on, as I've said. One day, it's a very small town, one day, about a year or so ago, some supporters of the English Defence League, you guys know the English Defence League, sort of EDL guys who sort of they're hard to pin down exactly. They're an interesting group because they sort of started on Facebook and then went into the real world after that. But he started as a member of the English Defence League. That's how he got into politics, through Facebook. He wasn't interested. A friend of his liked a Facebook page, and then he liked it too, and that's how he was drawn into this movement. Now, he never, ever saw or met anyone in his town that had similar views to him. And then one day, he was going down to the petrol station at the end of his road, and 3 lads with EDL hoodies on walked past chanting EDL. And I said to him, "Paul, well, that's sort of great. I mean, in a way, you could make some friends, you know, people." He was like, yeah, I thought it was really nice. It was really nice to see some fellow EDL people. I was like, "Oh, cool, did you speak to him?" "No." "Why didn't you speak to them?" I was like, "Well, I didn't really know what to say." So he just walked past, went back home, logged on, and then carried on his online blitz. He didn't want to speak to the offline people, because who is he offline? The real world Paul isn't really anything. These guys wouldn't know him. The digital Paul, the angry, violent, virulent neo-Nazi, he has a following, he has meaning. So he much preferred to leave these guys, walk home, and log back on. And the final one, normalization. This is a bit of a personal story as well, because over the course of a year, something that I discovered, and many of you have probably experienced it too, is the ease with which, if you surround yourself with the same images and the same ideas, it very quickly stops being shocking. When I first got on 4chan for this book, and on the random B board of 4chan, I could not believe what I was seeing. I'm quite easily shocked. Couldn't believe what I was seeing. Next day, didn't seem like a big deal whatsoever. A couple of days later, seemed pretty boring actually. I'd rather go and find something a bit more radical and extreme, if you don't mind. 4chan's pretty dull these days. And that's something that you see repeated over and over again. And that is a very good evolutionary trait for human beings to have, by the way. But it can lead you into some very, very dark places. And I'll give you the most sort of distressing story of all, which is of Michael, who, man in his 50s, convicted for the possession of 3,000 indecent images of children. Again, similar to Paul, in some ways, a very nice man on a personal level. But this was his story. And it is actually supported by a lot of research in this subject. He started off watching pornography, watching teen pornography. Now, teenage pornography, that being anything over the age of 18, technically, because anything below that is classed as child pornography or child abuse images, is by far the most popular, voluminous, and commonly searched for category of pornography. Teen pornography, which is slightly worrying, isn't it? And there is an enormous grey area, what's called jailbait pornography, which is anywhere between about 14 and 18, but it's very difficult for the Internet Watch Foundation or anybody else to be sure about people's age. People are changing how they look. And there is so much of that online as well, and it's incredibly difficult to police. And I know the work that Google has been doing on this subject and the money that you gave to the Internet Watch Foundation, partly as a result. Now, for Michael, what happened here, and it is a story I heard repeatedly, was that's where he started. A few weeks later, getting rather bored of this, shifted into jailbait pornography. After that, he wanted another taboo, went down a couple of years, another taboo needed to be found and breached, went down again. 2 or 3 years later, barely with him, and I believe him, barely with him realizing it, he'd suddenly wound up watching pornography of children under the age of 10, hardly realizing how he'd got there, and barely understanding himself how he'd ended up where he had. And to me, this is the story of that normalization and how that can happen. And I saw it happen with me on 4chan, also on the pro-anorexia sites. How in the beginning I found them so distressing and terrible. Pictures of emaciated bodies. By the way, this book is quite distressing to read. I should sort of warn you now. I hope it's interesting, but there are bits of it that are hard to read. But that's really why I wrote it. I wanted people to be slightly shocked. Started off being very shocked by the emaciated bodies, but then within, again, very soon afterwards, I was more interested in, well, which bits are emaciated? You know, that's an interesting pose, and she's really featured on her knees. And you start looking at these images in a very different way to how you started. And that's the story of Michael, even in the darkest and deepest bits of the book and of the net overall. So they're my 4 themes. And the final word, and it will be, there you go, exactly 30 minutes. The final word is, I was rather depressed writing a lot of this book. I found it extremely difficult at times, and a lot of time spent worrying and sleepless nights, and I sort of imagined it was because of the depressing and difficult subjects that I was having to work on. And it was partly that, but I think more so it was something far simpler, which is I was missing out on so much offline. I was just spending all of my day on the internet with these virtual characters, and I was missing all the rest of my social life, all the rest of my friends, all the other things I could do, and instead I was crunched over a computer screen and my entire life was being lived through this tiny little box. And so I ended up sort of coming out of the book far more worried, not about what people are doing online and where it takes them and why they do it, but how do we make sure people's lives offline are more meaningful, more interesting, more fulfilling for them? Because if they were, then I think they spend far more time there and far less time in some of these darker and worrying corners of the net. And that's it, I'm done. Thank you very much for listening. So I think I'm in charge of taking questions, aren't I? Yeah. So if anybody has any questions... Oh, yes.
Were you ever worried that you might be arrested during your research, and did you have a kind of backup plan for what you might do in that event?
I'm still worried that I won't be let into the United States because I said that I'd bought 1 gram of marijuana, and they have rather strict rules on this kind of thing. I went into this, started off thinking, I'm going to really get to the bottom of all this nasty, crazy, dirty internet stuff and really expose it for what it is. But there were so many bits where I just dared not click any further. I dare not go beyond that because I didn't, there's sort of one of the internet adages, you can't unsee what you've seen, and once you've done some, it was very easy, I think, in these sites and these communities to unknowingly step over the line. So I was incredibly careful. I went to see the police before I did any of this research. I tried to tell as many people as possible what I was doing. I was very careful not to do anything illegal, apart from that one case with the small amount of drugs, and I sort of determined that was you could make quite a good public interest case for buying such an incredibly small amount of drugs in that instance. So in the end, I wasn't actually that worried because I think I'd done it rather well. I was sort of more worried about whether any of the people that I'd been speaking to might be identified or that I might sort of cause them some distress or harm, even the people that I found objectionable. As a researcher, I'm not really an investigative journalist. I'm a sort of a standard researcher. I work for a think tank. I was more worried about making sure that the research participants weren't harmed, and I really tried to bend over backwards to mask who they really were and where they lived. Details are changed throughout, but without losing the thread of the story. And I think I've done it well enough, but people are smart. People can normally identify people, and all of these ethical questions are a question of judgment about what you think. Do you think you've done enough to protect the identity of individuals? Have you taken reasonable measures to do so? Have you informed them of your intention? Have you told them and showed them drafts of what you've done so they're content to be talked about in this way in the public domain? I did all of that stuff. I think I did it well enough. It's only been out for a month or so there's still time for me to get arrested, so maybe I shouldn't answer that question just yet. Thank you.
So 2 questions. First one, do you know if they can enforce you to, for example, child pornography, to tell the government or someone that names of people and stuff like that? Because you can mask things, but maybe they can get you to court to tell the names. So that's one.
I'm pretty sure they could. I mean, I could go to court over it as a journalist, saying I'll protect my sources to the death. Mm-hmm. But of course, they can sort of, whatever the equivalent of subpoenaing is in this kind, I don't know what the actual legal term is, but yeah, they could seize my computer and demand the passwords, and if I don't give them those under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act 2000, I could end up in prison for not disclosing my passwords. So yeah, they could.
Okay, and do you think you got to the bottom, or were there subjects that you didn't dare to go into?
People talk about this in terms of depth, like going deeper and deeper and deeper, but it's not really like that. Cyberspace doesn't really have any depth. It's sort of, if you know where the link is, it's as easy to get to the Silk Road as it is to get to the BBC. I mean, it's really simple. There are obviously, in particular communities within Facebook or on forums, there's a secret password protected forum, and within that you might meet people who tell you about another secret protective password forum. And no, I never felt like I'd got anywhere near the bottom. I mean, the problem is you never really know whether you're scratching the surface or you've reached the bottom, because you can never tell quite how far it goes. And I probably could have just spent another year constantly trying to follow links around and get further and further away from where I started. But I'm quite confident that I didn't get near the bottom, or whatever you want to call it, sort of the end of the line or whatever. Absolutely not. And I had to stop at certain places anyway. I decided I wasn't going to go trying to, under false pretenses, get into password-protected suicide forums, for example. I tended to go to the open ones. So there would have been that bit, for example, but there were other areas, yeah. You should read this more as a sort of a skirt across some of these cultures and communities. I had to make a decision between sort of a trade-off between depth and breadth, and I went for breadth. Okay. Even I'm using the depth and deep and stuff, even though I keep saying that's not what it is, but it's a very easy analogy to just sort of trip into.
I have a couple questions. First of all, what's your background? And second, if I were to pick up that book, would I just be able to understand anything, or should I read? This is like my first exposure to anything like this, so should I read more like this is what it is before I were to pick that up and read it?
The book is exceptionally well written. It's actually probably more intended for people like you than for people that have been on the Silk Road like you. Because it was meant to be, I mean, I sort of arrogantly hoped it would be like Louis Theroux online, sort of going to these places, explaining it really clearly. There's not much technical language in there. There's footnotes with really heavy detail. But it's a very, I hope, well, the intention was that it's a very accessible and simple guide to these cultures told through the stories of people. So whenever you bring people into it, it becomes immediately more accessible as well. There's a few descriptions of how the Onion Router, the Tor browser, actually works, and how Tor hidden services work and why they're hard to track down. But there's not so much of that, because I just thought what's interesting about these cultures is the people and how they behave and what they do, not really the technology that underpins it. And my background is in research. So I worked for a think tank, Demos, and for the last 7 years I've worked there doing social, political, cultural research using sort of standard methodologies of questionnaires and surveys and ethnography and polling on quite a wide array of subjects, but mainly looking at extremist and radical groups, political groups. And I did a big Facebook survey of the English Defence League. I've written a lot about intelligence work and how intelligence and policing use the internet. I wrote a paper with David Oman, former GCHQ director, about the police's and MI5 and GCHQ's use of the internet as a form of intelligence. And at the moment, I run a centre at Demos called the Centre for the Analysis of Social Media with the University of Sussex, where we're trying to develop computational natural language processing, so sort of automated text mining and analytics, trying to develop software that allows social scientists to be able to use and apply those computational methods for the purposes of social policy research. So essentially what's happened is all the stuff on big data analytics is really driven by people like you or advertising and marketing people, and not so much the social scientists, who I think have got an awful lot to bring to this in terms of deeper analysis, sampling methodologies, ethics of good research. So we're trying to combine and mix those disciplines.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hello.
Very interesting. Thanks for that.
Pleasure.
I was just wondering, I was interested more on the solution side. So you mentioned, for example, about moderating the suicide forums. Do you go into your book, and maybe you don't want to answer the question, which is fair enough, but do you have any suggestions, like if you had a magic wand, would you do anything about Silk Road, or some of the other things that you've come across in your research?
One of the reasons I made it a series of portraits rather than polemic is because I don't know what the answer is. I really don't. And the Silk Road is a combination. It's either it makes drugs easier to get and more drugs easier to get, but makes those drugs more reliable and safer. What's important to you? Is it that it's harder for people to get it, or assuming that they will get it, make sure it's better for them to get it? And that comes down to a sort of moral, personal, ethical judgment that you make. And it was quite similar on a lot of these subjects. So with Paul and the neo-Nazis, it's sort of often a question of erring on one side or the other between censorship or openness. And I tend to, having looked at what these guys do online, I tend to err on the side of openness and let them talk and hear them out and let them speak, give them a safety valve. It's really important because everything in the book, to me, suggests that every time you clamp down on anything, it pops up somewhere else or it goes somewhere else and it gets worse and it gets darker and it gets deeper. And actually bringing this stuff out into the open makes it far less terrifying than when it's hidden under the bed and sort of shoved away in a corner. Now, I know that's not a specific sort of clear government policy. It's just a general approach that I've sort of thought through for how we deal with all these difficult subjects online. And I sort of stop there because beyond that, I'm not sure. And that's not the purpose of the book, really.
Yeah, no, that's great. I guess where I was coming from was exactly that last point, where if we stop it, that might be good, but it will pop up again. But if we keep it going, it will get more extreme.
Well, the Silk Road, so when it was shut down in October, and they're doing a really decent trade. There was probably 3 big online drugs marketplaces or anonymous marketplaces. They're called darknet markets. 6 months later, there's about 30 of them. They're far harder to close down now than they were before. They're selling far more drugs than ever they were. And what really has been achieved by closing this down? More people know about it than ever. I'm probably contributing to that problem by writing about it. And they're smarter, harder to crack, more encrypted than they were before. So that is a pretty good... Yeah, I often sort of trotted out the easy liberal line that, well, I mean, if you censor something, I mean, it merely just comes out at another, it's even more radical. But I hadn't really seen evidence of it. That was a nice, comfortable assumption, philosophical assumption to draw, but I hadn't seen so much actual evidence of that. But I think in writing this book, I did see evidence. I did see evidence of that, and I saw how people get around censorship and how they work ways out of getting their message out. Nothing good ever comes of things being hidden and not allowed to be talked about and always off limits and always taboo. Nothing. So, again, it's an approach rather than a policy, but I agree with you on that.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Jeremy, thanks a lot. Question for me was thinking about anonymity has its importance, but credibility seems to also have an importance. And when you think about whether it's online forums or if it's on whether it's usage of Secret or Snapchat, and so the evolution of where people are having anonymous but controlled systems where they operate in, where does that fit in the way you've seen the darknet as it's evolving versus the open communities that?
Yeah, so the chapter 3 is about the cypherpunks. Anyone know the cypherpunks? You guys would be interested in the cypherpunks. So the cypherpunks were a group of American libertarians, Californian libertarians from the early 90s who more or less predicted all of this stuff and built systems of encryption. They predicted black markets. They did anonymous remailers. And it was all part of a political vision to try to undermine the power of the state. They were cryptocurrencies as well came from the cypherpunks, and it was actually on the cryptography mailing list that Bitcoin was first introduced. Part of a political project. The government can't trace what we're doing. It can't tax us. If it can't tax us, it's got no revenue. It can't control us. So it was currency. It was messages and communication. It was your online activity. Just a big battle over secrecy and privacy and anonymity online. The big challenge that they always faced was how do you combine anonymity with reputation? Because without reputation, black markets or any marketplace collapses. Any kind of social system collapses quite quickly. So they were obsessed with the idea of people building up reputable pseudonyms, identities that were online couldn't be traced back to the real you, but where you had an incentive to make sure you kept building up that positive reputation within your community. You were still totally secret about who you really were. It's a separate identity that was reputable. And that's the trick of the Silk Road. I mean, that's what the Silk Road has done. And that's exactly what the cypherpunks in the 90s were trying to develop systems to be able to work out. And I think there's a lot of modern cypherpunks The people behind Bitcoin are all cypherpunks. There's loads of them. And there's a huge growth of citizen encryption systems, and you've probably been following it post-Snowden especially. And that's always been the key, reputation versus anonymity. And I think on the Silk Road, why I think it's so innovative is they've worked out some ways around that. Where's that going to evolve and develop? I don't know, but it is going to evolve and develop.
And just a quick follow-on on that. How does that fit in with where like GCHQ or MI5, if they are understanding identity as a pseudonym and understanding online behavior as a pseudonym, is that sufficient, or will they still continuously try to link between online?
Well, they're going to continue to try and link. Of course they are. You can't prosecute a pseudonym. I mean, pseudonyms. I think this is going to be one of the big battles over the future of the internet. It is about the right to anonymity and pseudonymity, and whether companies are going to be forced to constantly track and sort of push together your online and your offline identities. And there's so many people out there who believe that you shouldn't do that. And that's a sort of citizen-led sort of rebellion against controlling your online identity and matching it against your offline one. Governments and big companies, of course, are going to constantly try and push those two identities together. Lots of citizen and civil liberties groups are going to keep trying to pull them apart. And that's going to be, I think, the battle over the next 5 or 10 years. But GCHQ are going to be on the side of pushing together. I think that's fair to assume.
Hi, Jamie. Where do you stand on the recent right to be forgotten rulings that we've seen in Europe versus America, and how obviously anonymity and that plays a massive part in your book, but in terms of governments getting involved and actually taking a position on what the individual right of a person is to be able to take down data that might be out there, etc. Do you believe that that should be within an individual's right, or is anything that one does online automatically potentially culpable or actionable based on that?
Well, I'm not a libertarian about internet freedom. I think it's extremely important that democratically elected governments are able to trace people, providing it's legitimate and proportionate. Security is incredibly important, and public safety. And I met a lot of people in these communities that really suffer online, and they're abused and they're stalked, and an increasing number of sort of domestic cases start on Facebook, and people are desperately they want to find who these people are bullying them, stalking them, and it's extremely important that we do police these parts of the internet, because I think it's wrong to think, especially as more and more people live more and more of their lives there, that it's somehow separate. It's not separate, and that also includes policing. No, but the right to be forgotten point, without wanting to sort of preach to the converted, I think it's completely ludicrous. I mean, mainly for practical purposes, it strikes me as extremely odd that it should fall to a private company to be asked to determine what is and what isn't available in the public domain. De facto, Google, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter have become the public space. It is where the public space is now. It's a sort of masked speaker's corner. It's where the big debates of the day play out. Now, I think we've got to be very careful, understand what you guys do, to cede total control, to sort of start pushing more and more in the responsibility over managing this space to companies who run it. Now, I know it's your server space, and you're going to have to, but I believe that most of you have a commitment to free expression. And the more and more we're just trying to police it and force people to take things down and ask lawyers sitting in California or wherever they're sitting to make decisions about that, the more and more the public space is becoming commercialized, complicated, really difficult. Quite apart from the fact that, as we've seen with this, the right to be forgotten appears to me to be more like the right to tell Google not to show this particular piece of data high up in the search results, but not actually take it offline, and then you'll be able to find out, there's already been sites set up to do this, to find out what things Google's been asked to remove. So it's barely a right to be forgotten, is it? It's more like a right to be remembered or to be highlighted as being asked to be forgotten about something. And that's a good analogy for the net in general. It's obviously, as you all know, it's incredibly difficult to censor and to remove items entirely. And because there's such a strong current of feeling against censorship, partly for the reasons that I've said, like the danger of over-censoring this public space, there's going to be a sort of battery of people that are ready to highlight attempts at censorship that appear to be overstepping the mark. So for that and a host of other reasons, it's ridiculous, genuinely ridiculous, sort of bewildering that it would pass. But that you can see that there has been a lot of public pressure or political pressure, maybe not even public pressure, political pressure, to be seen to be doing something about bad things going online. And as a result, the mentality is often, we need to do something, this is something, let's do this then, rather than thinking really carefully about what the best thing to do is.
Thanks a lot.
I guess this is probably the last question.
All right, Dave, we've got time for one last question.
One last question.
When I was listening to your speech, it was very interesting how you were talking about things like these suicide forums and things, and I was sitting there and all I was thinking was, well, I mean, technologically savvy suicide forums, as in people who know how to find these things and get to them, or buying drugs online or whatever, well, technologically savvy drug buyers, people who know how to get to them and find these things. And then at the end you said how you think what could make it better would be if people's lives were more interesting, maybe they wouldn't spend so much time in there. But then you also mentioned in your answer to one of the questions that you've explained how Tor browsers work and how encryption works and how people go about using these things. And I just wonder, are you not, as a result, through this book, empowering people who are probably quite curious but just not capable to become capable and get lost in this very world themselves?
It's probably the single question I sort of ask myself repeatedly, like, should I even write this thing? Is there a public interest to putting some of this stuff out there or not? I was very careful not to give a careful guide, like precisely how you do it, precisely how you stay totally secure if you're going to go onto the Silk Road, precisely what the names of all these different forums and places are. So I did what I could to sort of limit the guidebook problem. But in the end, I concluded, yes, it's quite possible that people will become fascinated by some of this and adventure in there and get stuck in there and lost in there and trapped in there. But in the end, I just decided society is usually better served when we know what's going on, rather than pretending it doesn't or hiding it or not talking about it, because people tend to find this stuff anyway. So my final conclusion was really, when I was thinking about this sort of ethically in my head, I think it's better that it's out there than it's not.
No, I agree. It's great that there's a revelation as to the stuff that's going on. It's just whether or not are there enough instructions there for people who read it to go, wouldn't mind finding out a bit more about this myself.
Is that a personal question?
Possibly. Well, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly,
Yeah.
I could well do so.
Yeah. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I tried carefully to avoid that. There may be bits where people, I mean, if no one's ever heard of the Silk Road and they see basically how good the quality of cocaine is that you can buy there, they might decide, I think I'm going to go on the Silk Road. And that's a possibility, but let's face it, the Silk Road has been talked about an awful lot for an awful long time. And most of these things do pop up in the news. As I said at the beginning, they do pop up in the news. You do hear about them, but actually I don't think you ever get quite the full picture. So if no one had ever mentioned the Silk Road before, and it had never been in the media, and I was the first person to discover it, I think I probably would be really careful about writing about it. I think most of these subjects, you've heard stuff about them. Anyone curious is going to have heard and found them. I'd rather sort of go in there and really find out why this stuff's happening.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You have to read it and find out.
Jamie, have you got time for one more question before we wrap up?
I was going to say a joke about that being a question, but yes. Yeah.
Hi, so I'm Oliver, and I think following on from Shane's question, where he's saying essentially for people who wouldn't have found out how to find something, whether you've written about it, in fact, it's really, really easy to find stuff, right? So I'm an 11-year-old, I can type porn into Google, and there's a picture of people having sex. So I click on something, I get a video, I can have homosexual, heterosexual, there's probably some not legal stuff on there. So it's actually, I think, more of a question to Googlers. At what point do we actually say, should it be moderated? because I think it's well enough not to have it openly advertised somewhere, but it's in fact very, very easily accessible. And I know within the company there's some programs going on having child settings, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is probably the other way around. A lot of stuff is out there. And for adults, I totally agree with you. Everybody should be able to see most things. I'm very liberal there, but where with children do we draw the line? And how do we moderate them? What would you do if you, I don't know whether you have children?
Sorry? I should put an 18 plus warning on the book maybe. So it's a you're right, it's a question for you. I think it's a question, I think more broadly, it's a question for public debate. It's a question that we sort of try to have to come to something of a uneasy conclusion collectively. And I don't think the answer just rests with Google, or certainly not with me. The one thing that I did notice overall is that I imagine that the darknet, as in Tor hidden services, the most anonymous bit of the internet, would be where I'd find all the nastiest stuff. And that's really not the case. It can be anywhere. It's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, beheading videos on YouTube. It's not all hidden away. It's very easy to find. And I often think back to, I'm 34 now, and if I was 14 or 15 and I had a smartphone and I had internet access at home, I dread to think I would be looking for everything all the time. There's no doubt about it, and sharing it amongst my friends and doing terrible stuff like that, sexting, and I can imagine, because I know what it's like when you're that age. And you'll find it, and these kids will find a way around it. So it is a really big question, I think, for all of us to try to answer. But I don't have the answer to that. I don't think you do, but I think collectively we can figure out something maybe slightly better than we have now.
I think we're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming in.